Take it off. You don't deserve to wear that honor. Judge Harold Varon's words struck like a whip across the silent courtroom. The command wasn't just legal, it was meant to humiliate, to strip dignity from a woman who had already given everything. In her wheelchair, Iris Caldwyn's hands did not tremble. With quiet defiance, she reached up, unpinned her silver star, the medal she had nearly died for, and placed it on the stand. The judge's smirk said he believed he had broken her. But what he didn't know was that the very woman he tried to humiliate once saved his own nephew's life. And in the next few minutes, the truth would not only destroy his career, it would shake the entire system. The courtroom was packed, every wooden bench filled with journalists, officers, and curious onlookers drawn by the high-profile trial. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the federal courthouse, casting sharp beams that made the marble pillars seem even taller, as if the weight of history itself pressed down on this room. At the center of it all, in her wheelchair at the witness stand, sat Iris Caldwyn, her posture straight, her gaze calm, and a small silver star pinned discreetly to her lapel. The medal glinted faintly under the overhead lights, a quiet symbol of sacrifice. To the veterans in the gallery, it meant blood, fire, and survival. To others, it was just another decoration. But to Judge Harold Varon, sitting high on his bench with cold, sharp eyes, it was an opportunity. Take it off, his voice cut the silence like a blade. You don't deserve to wear that honor in my courtroom. Gasps rippled across the gallery. Ethan Cole, the young prosecutor, started to rise in objection, but the judge's raised hand silenced him before a word escaped. The spectators shifted uncomfortably, sensing the cruelty beneath the command. For a long moment, Iris did not move. Her hands rested on the armrests of her wheelchair, her breathing steady. She wasn't trembling, though anyone else in her position might have. She had faced worse. Ambushes in the desert, firefights where every second meant life or death. Compared to that, this was only a battle of words and perception. Slowly, deliberately, she reached up. Her fingers touched the cool metal of the silver star. With quiet defiance, she unpinned it and laid it gently on the wooden stand before her. The faint clink of metal on wood echoed like a gunshot in the silence. Judge Varon leaned back, the corners of his mouth curling into a smirk. He believed he had broken her, reduced her to a humiliated figure stripped of dignity. What he didn't know, what no one in this room yet knew, was that this act would mark the beginning of his downfall. But for now, the humiliation seemed complete. The trial was about Meridian Defense Contractors, a powerful corporation accused of supplying faulty tactical vests to soldiers in the field. These vests were supposed to withstand standard rounds, but they hadn't. Men and women had died wearing them. Families had been left without answers. The government's case relied heavily on testimony from experts who had tested the gear. But Iris Caldwyn wasn't just any consultant. She was someone who had worn the vest in combat, someone who had seen it fail under fire. She knew what it meant when equipment betrayed the people who trusted it. Prosecutor Ethan Cole, his suit just slightly too big for his thin frame, leaned forward at the prosecution table. His face was young, his eyes determined. He had spent weeks preparing Iris's testimony, knowing that her credibility was the prosecution's strongest weapon and their greatest vulnerability. Ms. Caldwyn, Cole began, his voice steady but respectful. Could you please state your name and occupation for the record? Iris Caldwyn, she replied evenly, security consultant, specializing in military equipment assessment. Before Cole could proceed, the defense attorney, Victor Merrick, shot to his feet. Tall, silver-haired, and with a confidence that came from decades of winning cases for the powerful, Merrick's tone was dripping with disdain. Your Honor, I move to challenge the qualifications of this so-called expert witness. Judge Varon's eyes flickered with approval. Proceed, Cole tried to interject. Your Honor, Ms. Caldwyn has extensive... Overruled, Varon snapped, his voice sharp. The defense pressed forward. Ms. Caldwyn, isn't it true that your current occupation is as a civilian? That you no longer serve in any official military capacity? Yes, Iris answered calmly, her voice neither defensive nor apologetic. And yet, Merrick continued, pacing theatrically before the jury, you presume to lecture this court about the specifications of equipment designed for our most elite warriors? The insinuation was clear. She was disabled, in a wheelchair, no longer in uniform. To the jury, Merrick wanted her to appear as someone clinging to past glory. Ethan Cole rose quickly. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is badgering the witness." Judge Varon gave him a withering glare. "Overruled. The defense is entitled to test the witness's expertise." Cole sat down slowly, frustration tightening his jaw. He wanted to protect Iris, but every attempt was crushed beneath the judge's gavel. The system seemed stacked against them, and everyone in the room could feel it. Still, Iris remained composed, her scarred hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes meeting Merrick's without a flicker of fear. "The issue here," she said firmly, "is not my current uniform or lack thereof. The issue is whether Meridian's vest performed as advertised. And I can tell you, under fire, they did not." Her voice carried across the courtroom, calm but resonant. Even the spectators felt the weight of her words. But Judge Varon wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his smirk returning. "And yet, Ms. Caldwyn, we are asked to take your word for it, despite your limitations." The cruelty of the remark hung in the air. Cole clenched his fists under the table, his knuckles white. The defense lawyer smiled faintly, emboldened by the judge's open hostility. What the judge didn't realize was that every word, every slight, every deliberate act of humiliation was being noted. By the press, by the spectators, and by Iris herself. And soon the truth would come crashing down on him. The silence in the courtroom lingered, thick and heavy, after Judge Harold Varon's last cruel remark. He leaned back with smug satisfaction, convinced he had successfully undermined Iris Caldwyn's credibility. The jury shifted uncomfortably, while reporters scribbled furiously, aware they had just witnessed the kind of scene that would dominate headlines. But Iris remained calm. Her posture never wavered, her eyes never dropped. The silver star lay quietly on the stand, gleaming under the light, stripped from her by command, but somehow radiating even more meaning now that it wasn't pinned to her chest. "Your Honor," defense attorney Victor Merrick pressed, emboldened by Varon's hostility, "surely we cannot accept unverified claims from a witness who has concealed her medical condition, her past affiliations, and now sits here attempting to pass off limited civilian consulting as expert combat analysis. This entire testimony." The heavy wooden courtroom doors slammed open. The sound reverberated across the chamber like a cannon blast. Every head turned. An imposing figure entered. Admiral Nathaniel Cross. His decorated Navy uniform seemed to glow under the marble lights, his rows of ribbons and medals a living testimony of decades of service. His presence alone commanded silence. Even the bailiff froze mid-step. "Permission to approach," Admiral Cross said firmly, his voice steady, echoing with authority that not even Judge Varon could brush aside. "As an officer of the United States Navy, I carry documentation authorized for immediate disclosure." The judge blinked, momentarily startled. "This court—" But before he could finish, Cross handed a sealed folder to the bailiff, who brought it forward. The Navy seal on the envelope was unmistakable. The air itself seemed to tighten as the bailiff passed the folder up to Judge Varon. "Your Honor," Cross continued, standing at parade rest, "these documents have been cleared for review under direct authorization from the Secretary of the Navy. They pertain to Commander Iris Caldwyn's service record." Merrick frowned, his confidence faltering. Ethan Cole's eyes widened, hope flickering for the first time that day. The gallery leaned forward, sensing a storm about to break. Judge Varon reluctantly opened the folder. His eyes scanned the first page, then the second. His confident smirk faltered, replaced by a stiffness in his jaw. He turned another page, and the color drained from his face. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the faint rustle of paper. The spectators could almost hear the judge's breath hitch. Finally, Ethan Cole rose. "Your Honor, for the sake of the record, may we know the contents of these documents?" Varon didn't respond. His hands trembled slightly as he lowered the folder. Admiral Cross stepped forward, his voice steady and loud enough for all to hear. 3 years ago," Cross declared, "during Operation Kingfisher, Iris Caldwyn, then Commander Caldwyn, led an extraction mission under heavy fire. 16 hostages were rescued from a fortified compound. During the operation, Commander Caldwyn was critically wounded by enemy fire, sustaining spinal injuries that left her paralyzed from the waist down. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Journalists scribbled frantically, some already fumbling for their phones. Veterans in the gallery sat straighter, recognizing the weight of the revelation. Cross wasn't finished. He opened another page. Among those 16 hostages was a young second lieutenant. His name, Cross paused deliberately, letting the silence stretch, was Daniel Veyron. Gasps tore through the room like a wave. All eyes shot to Judge Harold Veyron, whose face had gone pale as stone. The name hung in the air, undeniable. Daniel Veyron, the judge's nephew. Iris did not move. Her eyes remained on the judge, steady, unreadable. She hadn't spoken a word since placing her medal on the stand, but her silence carried more power than anything shouted. Judge Veyron's lips parted, but no words came out. He glanced quickly toward the gallery, as if hoping the name would pass unnoticed. But it hadn't. The reporters were already writing furiously, and the spectators whispered to one another with incredulity. Ethan Cole seized the moment. Rising to his full height, his voice rang clear. So the very witness this court sought to humiliate, the one the defense dismissed as unqualified, is the same officer who once saved the life of your own family member, Judge Veyron? The young prosecutor's words cut like steel. Veyron slammed his gavel, his hand unsteady. Order! Order in this court! But the authority had shifted. The gavel sounded hollow now. The gallery ignored him, their murmurs rising louder. Admiral Cross continued with measured calm. This court has the right to question witnesses, yes, but it does not have the right to erase their service, nor their sacrifices. Commander Caldwyn is here under limited disclosure, bound by classification. Yet the truth is this: without her actions that day, 16 men and women would not be alive. One of them, Judge Veyron, was your own nephew. The silence that followed was heavier than gunfire. At the back of the room, a young man stood. His uniform identified him instantly. Lieutenant Daniel Veyron himself. He had slipped in unnoticed earlier, but now he walked forward, his face flushed with emotion. Your Honor, Daniel said, his voice carrying the weight of conviction. It's true. I owe my life to Commander Caldwyn. She pulled me out under fire. If she hadn't, I wouldn't be standing here today. The gallery erupted again. Reporters surged toward the aisle. Veterans in the audience nodded solemnly, their expressions grim but proud. Judge Veyron's face was ashen, his hands clutching the folder as if it might somehow shield him from the truth. But it was too late. The humiliation he had intended for Iris had turned full circle, and now it was he who stood exposed before the eyes of the world. Iris remained silent. She didn't need to speak. Her very presence, calm and steady, said everything. Judge Veyron cleared his throat, but his voice cracked. This court will recess. He slammed his gavel again, but even the sound betrayed his weakness. No one moved. All eyes were on him, watching as the once commanding judge sat frozen, pale, and stripped of authority. His career had just been shattered, not by argument, but by truth, and everyone in that room knew it. The atmosphere in the courtroom felt like a storm on the verge of breaking. Judge Harold Veyron sat frozen, pale as parchment, still clutching the Navy folder, as if it might somehow erase the truth Admiral Cross had laid bare. His gavel, once a weapon of authority, now sounded hollow. Then, as though fate had been waiting for the exact moment of his weakness, the heavy courtroom doors opened once again. This time it was Chief Judge Ellington Corwin, tall, stern, and unmistakably in command. His black robes swept behind him as he strode down the aisle, flanked by federal marshals. By order of the Judicial Council, he declared, his voice booming, I am assuming authority over these proceedings, effective immediately. Judge Harold Veyron, you are relieved. Gasps echoed across the chamber. Reporters scrambled to capture the words. The spectators whispered furiously, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Veyron's face drained of all remaining color. You can't, Veyron stammered, but the chief judge silenced him with a glare sharp enough to cut stone. Sit down. You have disgraced this bench long enough. For the first time in his career, Harold Veyron obeyed without argument. He sank into his chair, hands trembling, his authority stripped as completely as he had tried to strip Iris Caldwyn of her honor. Chief Judge Corwin addressed the courtroom. We will proceed. Evidence will be presented regarding obstruction of justice, bribery, and misconduct connected to both Judge Veyron and Meridian defense contractors. Ethan Cole straightened, his heart pounding. He had studied the files Admiral Cross brought, but now the chief judge was giving him full rein. Your Honor, the prosecution would like to submit Exhibit 47. The bailiff carried forward a stack of declassified communications, emails and memos pulled from Meridian's private servers. They were damning. Payments disguised as consulting fees, quiet dinners with key officials, promises of promotions in exchange for rulings favorable to the corporation. One line stood out above all. Veyron will ensure hostile witnesses are discredited. Payment processed. The courtroom exploded in murmurs. Reporters nearly fell over themselves trying to capture the line. Admiral Cross stepped forward again. Your Honor, additional investigation confirms that Judge Veyron actively pressured military officers, including his own nephew, to remain silent about Meridian's failures. At that, Daniel Veyron rose from the gallery. His uniform looked sharp, but his face carried the weight of shame. Slowly, he walked toward the witness stand. Permission to speak, Your Honor. Chief Judge Corwin nodded gravely. Proceed, Lieutenant. Daniel faced the courtroom, his voice unsteady at first, but growing stronger. 3 years ago, I was one of the hostages Commander Caldwyn saved. I should have testified about the failure of those vests long before today, but I didn't, because my uncle told me to stay quiet. He said the military needed discretion, not scandal. He told me if I spoke out, my career would be over. His words struck like hammer blows. Spectators gasped again, the betrayal cutting deeper than any financial corruption. This wasn't just bribery. This was silencing the truth at the cost of lives. Daniel's voice cracked as he turned to Iris. I'm sorry, I should have stood with you. You risked everything to save me, and I let my uncle's influence keep me silent. I failed you. I failed the men who died because of that equipment. For the first time since the trial began, Iris shifted in her seat. She studied Daniel, her eyes calm, her expression unreadable. Then softly she said, You were young. You were under his power. What matters now is that you're here, telling the truth. A hush swept the courtroom. Those words carried more than forgiveness. They carried authority. Iris was no longer just a disabled veteran fighting to be heard. She was commanding the room without raising her voice, embodying the quiet strength of someone who had already given more than anyone else present. Chief Judge Corwin leaned forward, his voice solemn. The evidence of bribery and obstruction is overwhelming. Proceedings will continue against Meridian. As for Harold Veyron, he paused, his eyes cold as they locked on the disgraced judge. A formal judicial conduct investigation is already underway. Effective immediately, you are suspended from the bench. Veyron's head dropped. The once imposing judge now looked small, shrunken under the weight of his own disgrace. The gallery erupted, but this time not in shock. It was in something closer to vindication. Veterans in the audience nodded firmly, some with tears in their eyes. Family members of fallen soldiers clutched each other's hands, seeing justice inch forward. And the reporters, they no longer had to sensationalize. The story was writing itself. The fall of a powerful judge, brought down by the very woman he tried to humiliate. Ethan Cole stole a glance at Iris. Hours earlier, he had feared that her testimony might collapse under the defense's attacks. But now she wasn't just surviving the courtroom. She was redefining it. Every eye was on her, and the looks were different now. No longer pity or skepticism, but respect, reverence. When Iris spoke again, it was not to the judge, nor the jury, nor the lawyers. She looked straight into the gallery at the families of soldiers who had lost everything. This isn't about medals, she said quietly. It's about lives. It's about making sure the next young soldier doesn't die because someone cut corners for profit. The silence that followed was absolute. Every soul in the room felt the truth of her words. By the time Chief Judge Corwin adjourned for the day, the transformation was complete. Iris Caldwyn had entered the courtroom as a fragile witness in the eyes of many. A woman in a wheelchair, easy to dismiss, easy to underestimate, but she left it as something entirely different. To the public, to the press, to the families who listened with tears in their eyes, she was no longer a victim of humiliation. She was a hero, and Harold Varon, once untouchable, was now nothing more than the disgraced shadow of a man who had underestimated the wrong woman. The courtroom battle had ended, but the war for truth had only begun. Weeks later, the battleground shifted from marble courtrooms to the grand chambers of Congress. The hearing room was vast, its walls lined with flags, its ceiling hung with golden lights that glared down like judgment itself. Rows of officials filled the chamber, generals in crisp uniforms, procurement officers with thick folders, and executives from the largest defense contractors in the nation. Reporters packed the back rows, cameras ready, and at the center, seated before the committee, was Iris Caldwyn. She wore no medals this time, only a plain navy suit, but her presence commanded the room more than any decoration ever could. At the head of the committee sat Senator Margaret Harlow, chairwoman of the Armed Services Oversight Committee. A formidable woman in her 60s, Harlow's reputation was one of steel integrity. She struck the gavel. "This hearing will come to order," she announced. "Today we examine the failures in procurement that cost American service members their lives, and the reforms proposed to ensure this never happens again. Commander Iris Caldwyn, thank you for being here." Iris inclined her head. "Senator, members of the committee." The air was thick with tension. Behind Iris sat rows of families who had lost loved ones to failed equipment, their presence a silent indictment of the system. One by one, senators questioned her, some sympathetic, others skeptical. "Commander Caldwyn," one senator began, "do you truly believe the failures stem from negligence or from unavoidable risk of war?" Iris's voice was steady. "War always carries risk, but when a vest rated to stop a round fails against the very ammunition it claims to protect against, that isn't war. That's fraud. That's negligence. And soldiers paid with their lives." Her words struck like a hammer. Families in the gallery nodded, some wiping tears. Then came the resistance. A man in a gray suit, CEO of a rival defense corporation, leaned forward from the witness table. "With all due respect, Commander, our industry already adheres to rigorous testing standards. What you propose would slow production, increase costs, and compromise readiness. We cannot burden taxpayers with unnecessary reforms." The words hung in the air, polished and rehearsed. Iris turned to him, her expression calm but cutting. "Unnecessary reforms. Tell that to the families of the soldiers who wore Meridian's vests into combat and never came home. Tell them cost mattered more than their sons and daughters." The gallery stirred. The executive shifted uncomfortably. Senator Harlow leaned forward. "Commander, please outline your proposal." Iris opened a folder of her own. Pages of data, casualty reports, and field notes lay within. She slid the top sheet across the table. "I call it the Caldwyn Protocol." She paused, letting the name settle. "The protocol mandates that any equipment issued to service members must undergo independent live fire testing under battlefield conditions, not just laboratory simulations. Results must be published, transparent, and subject to congressional review. And procurement decisions can no longer prioritize lowest cost over proven effectiveness. If a CEO makes a decision that saves money but costs lives, that should be treated as negligent homicide." The room erupted in murmurs. The phrase carried weight, heavier than any technical explanation. Executives pushed back immediately. "This is outrageous," one barked. "You can't compare corporate decisions to homicide. Companies will be paralyzed, innovation will stall, and—" "Enough!" Senator Harlow snapped, silencing him. She turned back to Iris. "Continue." Iris looked down the long table, her gaze sweeping over the senators, the generals, the lobbyists, and the grieving families. "You cannot put a price tag on a soldier's life. Every shortcut, every dollar saved at the expense of safety is a death sentence waiting to be signed. If that's not a crime, then what is?" The words landed like thunder. For nearly an hour, the debate raged. Industry executives painted Iris as unrealistic. out of touch with budgetary realities. Some senators worried about cost, others whispered about lobbyists waiting outside. But Iris did not waver. She answered every question with calm precision, backing every statement with evidence. More importantly, she reminded everyone of the faces behind the numbers, the soldiers who had trusted their equipment and never returned. Finally, Senator Harlow struck the gavel again. Enough! The room stilled. She looked directly at Iris, then at the gallery of families, then at the executives who had tried to dodge responsibility. This committee has heard both sides, and let me make one thing clear. Cutting costs is not an excuse for cutting lives short. Commander Caldwyn is right. What happened was not an accident of war. It was a failure of conscience, and this Congress will not allow it to continue. A ripple of relief swept through the room. Families squeezed one another's hands. Veterans nodded solemnly. Even some senators who had remained silent until now found themselves nodding along. Harlow raised her gavel once more. This committee will move forward with adopting the recommendations outlined in the Caldwyn Protocol. The chamber erupted in applause, not common in such hearings, but unstoppable. The sound rose like a wave, a rare moment of unity in a place usually fractured by politics. Iris did not smile. She merely inclined her head, her eyes glistening but steady. She hadn't come for applause. She had come for justice, and in that moment, the transformation was complete. What began as a trial meant to humiliate her had grown into a national reckoning. Her name, once dismissed, would now be written into the very policies that govern the safety of those who served. The Caldwyn Protocol was no longer just a proposal. It was a promise. Never again would soldiers die because profit outweighed protection. The downfall of Judge Harold Valor came swiftly. Within days of the congressional hearing, headlines blazed across the nation. Federal judge resigns amid bribery scandal. Valor under federal investigation for obstruction of justice. The once untouchable man who had mocked a decorated veteran now stood humiliated, stripped of power, his career in ashes. Reporters swarmed outside his home, but he offered no comment. He had already signed his resignation letter. Waiting for him on the other side of that resignation was Special Agent Lucas Hale of the Department of Justice. Sharp-eyed, relentless, Hale carried the case file that would determine the rest of Valor's life. Bribery, obstruction, witness tampering. The charges stacked higher with each new document uncovered. Judge Valor, Hale said coldly as cameras flashed, you'll be answering for more than your arrogance. At the same time, Meridian Defense Contractors, the company that had supplied faulty vests, began to collapse under the weight of criminal indictments. Its boardroom, once filled with polished suits and self-assured executives, was now the scene of FBI raids and subpoenas. Several top directors were marched out in handcuffs, accused of fraud, negligent homicide, and conspiracy. The company that had once stood as a proud supplier to the U.S. military was now synonymous with greed and betrayal. For the families who had lost sons and daughters, it was not enough to replace their grief, but it was justice, finally served. And then, away from the noise of headlines and flashing cameras, Iris Caldwyn chose silence. On a gray afternoon, she rolled her wheelchair along the quiet rows of white marble headstones at Arlington National Cemetery. The air smelled faintly of cut grass, and the distant sound of taps carried from another burial nearby. She stopped before one marker. Commander Julian Ashford, loyal friend, fearless leader, fallen hero. Her eyes lingered on the inscription. Ashford had been her commanding officer, the one who shielded her team during Operation Kingfisher, sacrificing his life so she and the hostages could escape. Without him, she would not be here. I did it, Ash, she whispered. Her voice trembled, but did not break. We got them to listen. We forced them to change. The Caldwyn Protocol is real. They'll never ignore the cost of lives again. For a moment, she let the silence answer. The wind stirred the flags that dotted the rows of graves. She laid a small Navy crest at the base of the stone. This victory is yours as much as mine. That night at the Pentagon, leaders raised glasses to the reforms now underway. Procurement processes were rewritten. Testing standards were transformed. The Caldwyn Protocol became a symbol of accountability, a reminder that equipment was not just steel and fabric, but the line between life and death. But Iris was not there to hear the applause. Her legacy did not need receptions or speeches. She had found her closure at Arlington, beside the man who had given everything. The world would remember her differently now, not as the woman in a wheelchair mocked in a courtroom, not as a fragile witness crushed under cross-examination, but as the veteran who stood silently, defiantly, and turned the system on its head. Judge Harold Varon's arrogance had ended his career. Meridian's greed had destroyed its empire. But Iris Caldwyn's perseverance had rewritten policy, saved future soldiers, and forced a nation to confront its conscience. One woman, bound to a wheelchair, had shifted the weight of an entire defense system. And in that truth lay the final, undeniable legacy. Sometimes the smallest voice in the room carries the power to change everything. When we step back from the drama of the courtroom and the power struggles in Washington, the story of Iris Caldwyn leaves us with a question that reaches far beyond military contracts. What does it mean to honor sacrifice in a society that often values profit over principle? In modern America, we face echoes of this dilemma every day. Whether it's the safety of our bridges and highways, the reliability of our healthcare system, or the way companies handle emerging technology, decisions are constantly being made that balance cost against human well-being. And just like those faulty vests on the battlefield, when shortcuts are taken, it is ordinary people who bear the heaviest price. Iris's courage reminds us that one person's persistence, even someone underestimated, overlooked, or silenced, can change the course of an entire system. She didn't raise her voice in anger. She didn't wield power or wealth. What she carried was truth in the determination not to let it be buried. That is a lesson as vital today as it was in that courtroom. But here is where I want to invite you, the audience, into the conversation. If you were in Iris's position, stripped of dignity in public, underestimated because of circumstance, would you have had the strength to stay calm and let the truth speak for itself? And what do you think about the idea that cutting corners to save money should be treated as seriously as a crime? Is that justice, or is that too far? These are questions America still wrestles with. And perhaps the true legacy of this story is not just the reforms Iris inspired, but the debate she leaves for us to continue. So now I want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us if you believe her story reflects broader issues we face today. Do you think the Caldwyn Protocol should be a model beyond the military, maybe even in healthcare, infrastructure, or other industries where lives are at stake? Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it moved you, if it made you think, then please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it so more people can join in this discussion. Because stories like these aren't just about the past. They're about the choices we make right now, for the kind of country we want to live in.